Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares. Tonight, we're diving into something truly bizarre, life glitch in the Matrix stories. These are the moments when reality itself seems to break, when people experience impossible coincidences, lost time, or even meet versions of themselves that shouldn't exist. These stories will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world around you. Before we begin, I want to share something personal. I'm raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and any support would mean the world to me. If you'd like to help, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here now. Let's step into the strange and unexplainable. Story 1. Weird but happy. About 5 years ago in November, we lost our family dog to cancer. She was the dog my children grew up with, loved by all. That Christmas, at the end of a day filled with gifts, food, and family, as I was picking up, I found a tiny pewter dog figurine sitting on the mantel. I asked everyone who had been at the house that day if they had left it, but no one had. It was strange, but I took it as a good omen. When my eldest went back to college at the end of Christmas break, he asked if he could take the little figurine to remember his dog. Of course, I said yes. A week or two later, while picking up around the house, I noticed the figurine sitting there again. I called my son and said, "You forgot the dog figurine." He replied, "No, I didn't. It's right in front of me on my desk." I had now found a second figurine. Again, no one claimed to know anything about it. I have no idea how it happened, but I still have both of them tucked away on a shelf to this day. Story 2. Millie was a rescue cat my family had when I was a teenager. She had a tough life before coming to us and suffered some brain damage, so she needed constant care and supervision, even when playing outside. One day, I was watching her play in the yard. After a while, she came to sit on the arm of the bench next to me, basking in the sun. As it started getting dark, I called her to follow me inside. When she stood up, I noticed a small metal object underneath her. Curious, I picked it up. It was a tiny silver angel charm. Since she had found it, I figured it should belong to her. I fastened it to her collar, and from that day on, she always wore it. That angel stayed with her until she passed last year. A while after she was gone, my mom decided to adopt another cat. While going through old RSPCA rescue files, she came across Millie's adoption records. The file listed her details, markings, date of birth, health conditions, and her original name, Angel. The reason it's so strange is that the angel charm seemingly appeared out of nowhere. It didn't belong to me or anyone we knew, and it was found under Millie in our securely enclosed back garden. Millie also had a particular hatred for Budashi, would find my mom's statues, throw up on them, decapitate them, or push them down the stairs and shatter them, but that's another story. Story 3. 3 years ago, my childhood dog passed away suddenly and unexpectedly. She had been sick for a few days, but seemed to recover before deteriorating rapidly and dying in my dad's arms. I live out of state, about 6 hours away, so I wasn't able to be there. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt that she passed without me. She had been my best friend for 12 years, and we had a deep bond. Her death devastated me. I couldn't work, I couldn't eat, and I would burst into tears constantly. My heart ached, and I kept apologizing to her for not being there when she needed me. Then, one night I had a dream. In the dream, I was in an empty space, when suddenly, Charlie came running up to me, whimpering excitedly. She was licking my face, her tail wagging furiously, just completely overwhelmed with joy. I was sobbing. I knew she was dead. I knew she was visiting me in my dream. It was all so clear and real. I hugged her tightly, apologizing over and over for not being there, but she just kept licking my face, full of love. I woke up with tears streaming down my face. I sat up in bed, still feeling her presence. Then, something caught my eye. I reached for my sleeve and pulled off one of her hairs. She had never been to my apartment. I hadn't seen her recently, and it wasn't from my cat Charlie. It was a collie mix, and her fur was unmistakable. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but it felt so vivid and real. I like to believe she visited me that night to let me know everything was okay. I haven't had a dream like that since. Story 4. I died. I saw it. I lived it. Either it was another world with a version of me that died, or I'm going crazy, but I died. We had a pep rally in school, and after it was finished, we had to go back to class. Well, my friend and I weren't into that, so we wanted to go across the street to Sonic. The street in front of the school doesn't have heavy traffic, but if you don't pay attention, you could get hit. I remember walking with him when he dropped something, so I went across the street first. That's when I saw a red Tahoe heading right for me, and then I got hit. I remember everything. I remember gasping for air, waking up, then fading out again. Then nothing. All of a sudden, I was back in the stadium at the pep rally again, and the exact same words came out of the principal's mouth. My friend turned to me and said he wanted to go to Sonic, but I was freaking out. I kept asking him questions, trying to understand what was happening. I thought it had to be a dream, so I went with him just to see what would happen. He dropped his stuff again, and this time I waited. To my horror, that same red Tahoe showed up. I told him, I'm going back to school. I ain't dying again. I can still see the other version of me on that street, messed up, not even moving. Story 5. This summer, I bought my girlfriend a last-minute birthday trip to go kayaking around the San Juan Islands off the Washington state coast. After a long drive and ferry trip, we found our tour group of about 20 people and were shuffled into a shuttle van for a ride to the beach. Now, my girlfriend has a unique name, similar to that of a famous painter. Let's say it's Rebecca Warhol. For fun, it's not. She's a little ray of sunshine and started chatting with the middle-aged woman sitting next to her on the shuttle. As we waited to leave, the woman mentioned that she had always loved the name Rebecca because it was her mother's name. They made pleasant small talk until the tour guide passed around the sign-in sheet for us to fill out. That's when things got strange. My girlfriend wrote her full name on the sheet and passed it to the woman, who immediately gasped, "Oh my God," and started crying. After a few moments of confusion, she explained, Rebecca Warhol was my mother's full name, and these islands were her favorite place in the world. She passed away this summer from cancer, and we've traveled hundreds of miles to spread her ashes here. We were stunned. I had picked a random date, time, and tour company. Then, we ended up in the same group as this woman. Then, my girlfriend was seated right next to her on the shuttle. She continued, "My daughter told us that Nana Rebecca would be with us on this trip, and I didn't believe it until now. It was the most unbelievable coincidence we had ever experienced, and it convinced me that there's more to this world than we think." As my brother later said, the universe winked at us that day. Story 6. Several years ago, I went home, turned on my PC, browsed the web for a bit, and even watched a video about the Matrix. At some point, I looked out my window. Then, I suddenly snapped awake, still sitting in my chair. I looked at my monitor and saw that it had turned off. I thought, strange, I must have fallen asleep, and moved my mouse to wake my PC from sleep mode. It didn't wake up. Confused, I looked down and noticed that the power strip wasn't even plugged in. It had never been turned on in the first place. That one weirded me out for quite a while. I must have gone home, fallen asleep, and dreamt the whole thing. At least, I hope so. Story 7. In college, I took a hard news, soft news journalism class, and one of our assignments was to write an obituary for one of our grandparents. The professor told us to write about a deceased grandparent, but if all of ours were still alive, we had to pick one. In my case, all of my grandparents were still alive. I procrastinated on the assignment until the night before it was due. The whole thing felt morbid, especially since I had no deceased grandparents to write about. At the last minute, scrambling for an easy option, I called my mum to get some basic biographical information about my maternal grandfather. As we talked about his career, she couldn't recall the name of one of the companies he had worked for. She scolded me for waiting until the last minute, reminding me that it was late 10:30 p.m. in my grandpa's time zone. Still, she agreed to call him to see if he was awake and could answer my question before my assignment was due in the morning. Then, everything changed. When my mom called my grandpa, my grandma answered the phone in a panic. She frantically explained that paramedics had just arrived and were performing CPR on my grandpa. He had stopped breathing and lost consciousness. My mom stayed on the phone with my grandma as the paramedics worked, but when they took him to the hospital, he was declared dead. In the time that my mom and I had been discussing his obituary, he was dying. His death was completely unexpected. He was in his 80s, but at the time, he was the healthiest of all my grandparents. In the end, the obituary I wrote for my class assignment became his actual obituary. The timing still freaks me out to this day. Story 8. Every night, I go to bed about 2 hours before my husband. I always wake up when he comes into the room. One night, he was gaming with a friend, and hours later, I heard him sneak into the room and crawl across the floor, getting ready to pop up and scare me. I felt the floor shake slightly and heard him bump clumsily against the side of the bed in the dark. I held out my hand and begged him not to scare me. I told him I was already scared enough and just wanted him to take my hand and come to bed. I couldn't see anything, but I knew he was there. I just waited, expecting him to jump up at any second so I could get it over with and go back to sleep. Then I heard him talking to his friend in the other room. I froze. I know there's sleep paralysis, lucid dreaming, or some kind of logical explanation, but I would have sworn on my son's life that someone had crawled across the floor and jostled the bed. Eventually, I worked up the courage to grab my phone and text my husband, asking him to come in, turn on the lights, and check under the bed. But holy shit, it still boggles my mind how real it felt. Story 9. A friend and I went to a buddy's house for a birthday party. We stayed up late playing Halo 2 and hanging out before crashing in the basement. Sometime during the night, my friend who came with me and I woke up at the exact same time, not one after the other, but at the same moment, and both rushed to the bathroom. R was more athletic than me, probably still is, and beat me there. I ran upstairs, barely making it to the toilet before puking my guts out. Meanwhile, R was doing the exact same thing downstairs in the basement bathroom. I was wearing a wooden cross my grandmother had mailed me from Romania. I'm not religious, but I appreciated the gift since I had never met her at that point. Somehow, while I was throwing up, the cross detached from the cord, fell onto the tile, and broke into 2 pieces. Both of us called our moms and got picked up. By then, it was around 3 or 4 a.m. The weirdest part. As soon as I got into the car and we drove a few blocks away, I felt perfectly fine. No sickness, no dizziness, completely normal. Later that day, Al messaged me on MSN and told me he felt the exact same way. The moment he left the house, it was like nothing had ever happened. A few weeks later, I got the pictures from that night developed. There was one of us sitting on the couch, rocking some Halo, and the whole room looked like it was filled with mist. Super spooky. I've been searching for that picture for years, but I can't seem to find it anymore. Every few years, my sister and I go through my mum's old photo albums, hoping to come across it again. Story 10. I once clocked out of work at 6 p.m, like I always did at the time, and began my hour-long train ride home. After finding a seat, I fell asleep and woke up just before my station. From there, it was a short 10 to 15 minute bus ride to reach home. During the entire journey, I didn't check my phone, and I don't wear a watch, so I never really noticed the time. When I walked into my house, my family looked surprised and said, "You're home early? Everything all right?" I glanced at the wall clock. It was just about to be 6 p.m. I was too shocked to understand what had happened. I immediately checked other clocks, my phone, my computer. Everything and the time was correct. A few days later, the admin emailed us the monthly timesheets, showing the times we clocked in and out. Every single day, including that one, showed me clocking out at exactly 6 p.m. So it definitely wasn't that I had left work early. To this day, I haven't figured out how I gained between 60 to 90 minutes that evening. Story 11. I had just pulled into the parking lot where I worked and was walking toward the building. It was around 3 in the afternoon, broad daylight. Suddenly, I heard an ambulance siren start blaring. Naturally, I looked down the road to see where it was coming from. I spotted the ambulance approaching and decided to watch it for a moment as it got closer. It was about to pass right by me when it went behind a large SUV that was waiting to turn out of the parking lot. The SUV blocked a small section of the road from my view, probably just a few meters. Then, in that exact instant, the siren went completely silent and the ambulance vanished. I was so confused. It was broad daylight and there weren't many cars on the road. I did a triple take, scanning in both directions, expecting to see it further down the road, but there was nothing. No ambulance, no sirene. Just gone. I walked up and down the sidewalk for a solid minute, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no trace of it. I was well rested, sober, and have never had hallucinations. It seems like something small, something easy to dismiss, but I was completely aware of what happened, and to this day, I can't explain it. Story 12. It was broad daylight, and I was sitting at a stoplight, waiting to turn left under a highway bridge. In front of me and to the left was the turnaround lane for traffic coming from the other direction. I suddenly heard a police siren approaching. Looking up, I saw a motorcycle cop with his lights flashing, chasing a white SUV. The white SUV turned left into the turnaround lane, with the cop about 20 feet behind. And that's when things got weird. Both the SUV and the motorcycle cop were going around 25 miles per hour. Just as the cop entered the turnaround lane, he passed behind a small concrete pillar and, at that exact moment, his siren shut off completely. He never came out from the other side of the pillar. The white SUV kept going like nothing had happened, heading toward a Chicken Express just up the street. I just sat there, staring, trying to process what I had just seen. How had the cop gone from moving at 25 miles per hour to a complete stop in an instant? The pillar was small, barely big enough to hide him front to back, but somehow he had completely disappeared. When the light turned green, I drove forward and checked behind the pillar. I expected to see him there somehow, but he was gone. That motorcycle cop was swallowed before my eyes into another dimension, and I think the white SUV did it somehow. Story 13. I have a good one. I was about 12 years old and woke up in the middle of the night, needing to take a leak. I walked across the hall to the little bathroom, hit the lights, and was about to reach for the toilet when I glanced up and saw a face in the mirror. It was not my face. It was as if someone was on the other side, standing to the right, with their face right next to the glass, staring at me. I only saw it for the briefest moment, but it is seared into my brain. I screamed and ran out of there to find my dad. Of course, he investigated, then tried to calm me down. Eventually, we had a prayer session because I was so freaked out. I must have gone back to sleep at some point. Fast forward to my 30s. I had completely forgotten about the event. One night while visiting, my dad quietly brought it up. "Remember that one time you saw a face in the mirror?" The memory hit me like a rush, sending a chill down my spine. "Yeah, I remember. "Well," he said, "I sometimes think about that night." He looked down at the floor, his face serious. "I saw it too." He went on to describe exactly what I had seen. Apparently, when he investigated, he saw it too and had a freak out of his own. The prayer session wasn't just for MIT, was for him too. I respect him for keeping that tidbit from me until my 30s, but honestly, I kinda wish he never told me. Story 14. I had a very important document that I only ever kept in one place, the top drawer of a small filing cabinet. I never moved it, and every time I opened that drawer, I would see it sitting there. The day finally came when I needed it, and I didn't even think twice about it. I knew exactly where it was. Well, I'll be damned if it wasn't there. Cue panic attack. I tore that filing cabinet apart. I removed everything, spread out all the papers, flipped them over, dug through envelopes, shook everything out. I even shined a flashlight through the emptied cabinet in case, somehow, the document had gotten stuck to the sides. It was nowhere. I can assure you, no one took it, and no one was messing with me. I was so frustrated. I even looked through other parts of my house, even though I knew it wouldn't be anywhere else, and sure enough, it wasn't. Over and over, I kept going back to that dumb filing cabinet. Still nothing. Super irritated, I searched the house one more time. On my way back downstairs to the filing cabinet, I shouted out in frustration, "Okay, bring it back." I don't even know who I thought I was talking to, because I was completely alone. But you guessed it, when I opened the filing cabinet one last time, the document was right there in the top drawer. Exactly where it should have been all along. I was relieved, and completely freaked out. Story 15. So this has always bothered me. I was 13 years old at the time, and my dad was a coal miner. He worked the third shift, known as the hoot owl shift, which ran from midnight to noon. That meant he would get home around 2 p.m, sleep until 9 p.m, wake up to have dinner with us, and then leave for work. My dad was always pretty gruff, and would yell at us if my younger brother or I made too much noise and woke him up. As an adult now, I completely understand why. One day, I did something that woke him up. I don't even remember what. He called me back to his bedroom, and I braced myself, expecting a lecture. But instead, he just looked at me and said, "It's okay. Come over here and give me a hug." I was 13. What teenage boy wants to hug their dad? I squirmed, feeling awkward. Then he followed up with, "What if something happened to me?" He just lay there, grizzled and tired, looking at me. I didn't hug him. That night, there was an accident in the mine. He saved everyone on his crew, including the one person he went back in for. His was the only death, and I'm convinced he knew it was going to happen. I'll never forget the look in his eyes that day. If someone asks you for a hug, give it to them. I love you, Dad. Story 16. So, this might be hard to explain. I was probably 12 years old and lived in a big log cabin with my family. One day, while my parents were at work, I got into a fight with my brother, who was 18 at the time and had some anger issues. He started chasing me through the house, so I ran outside, around the porch, and back in through another door. My plan was to lock it behind me, but I didn't have time. He was too close behind me. So, I slammed the door shut and kept running. When I glanced back, expecting to see him bursting through the door after me, I saw something else instead. He was outside, banging on the window of the door, yelling at me to unlock it. The door was locked. That was impossible. There was no way he could have locked it because the only way to lock that door was from the outside with a key. And our parents never gave us keys. It also couldn't have locked when I slammed it shut. You had to fully turn the lock, and even then, it usually needed extra finagling to actually catch. I stood there for a few seconds, completely dumbfounded. Then, my survival instincts kicked in, and I ran to the bathroom and locked myself inside. To this day, I truly believe something saved me that day. Story 17. Well, my story is a bit creepy because I lost myself for about an hour. This happened about 7 years ago when I was still in high school. It was a normal day and everything was fine until math class began. The teacher started explaining the lesson and how it connected to the previous day's class. But as he spoke, I realized that everything he was saying was completely new to me. I had no memory of the previous lesson at all. At first I thought, yeah, sure, maybe I wasn't paying attention again. But then I opened my notebook to check what I had written from the last class because I always took notes during math. I was terrible at it, and my dad was strict about my grades, which made my teacher extra strict with me. So I never skipped writing things down, but my notebook was empty. I asked my friend sitting next to me to let me see his notes, and he had a full page of new material from the last class material I had never seen before in my life. At this point, I started freaking out. After class, I went around asking my classmates the same strange question. Was I here yesterday during math class? They all looked at me like I was crazy and said, "What?" So I explained everything, and every single person I asked told me I was not there. The strangest part, I had attended both the class before and the class after math. I had written down notes for both subjects. There was no record of me ever leaving the classroom, and yet I was gone for that 1 hour. Where did I go? I have no idea. And what's even weirder is that in my school, we had a one-class system, where students stayed in the same classroom, and teachers rotated in and out for each subject. So we knew each other well, and if I had left, someone would have noticed. But no one did. So yeah, for 1 hour, I lost myself. Story 18. I was a young boy, probably 5 or 6 years old, maybe 7, at summer camp. One day, the supervisors took all the kids to a swimming pool, and we were having a great time. One of the supervisors was throwing kids into the pool. We'd splash around, climb out, and get tossed in again. It was my turn to be thrown in, so I ran up, got picked up, and flung into the air. But I forgot to take a breath before I hit the water. I sank deeper than usual and suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to breathe. I fought it as hard as I could, but eventually I couldn't hold it anymore. I inhaled underwater, and then I breathed air. I swear, I'm not making this up. It felt exactly like taking a deep breath of fresh air. My lungs and body relaxed as if I had just surfaced. I was so confused that I swam around underwater for a bit, testing it. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the feeling of drowning. I felt completely normal. Then, a thought popped into my head. Maybe I shouldn't test this too much. Maybe I should just count my blessings and go up ... So, I surfaced, and that was it. The rest of the day was completely normal, and I never told anybody. I should mention that when I was really young, around 2 to 4 years old, I had a few hallucinations. Once, while walking down a hallway in my house, I suddenly started floating in mid-air. If I thought about it or questioned it, I would start sinking. But if I just relaxed and accepted it, I could float again. That only happened once, but I had dreams for years where the same thing would happen until puberty, when they stopped. I don't know what happened that day in the pool. My first thought, even at the time, was that it had to be another hallucination. But the part I still don't understand is why I was desperately gasping for air before it happened, and why I felt so calm and relaxed afterward, as if I had actually breathed. I even stayed underwater for a bit, just because it was so surreal. Story 19. This didn't happen to me, but to my mother and aunt when they were younger, and to this day, it's the creepiest thing I've ever heard. When they were around 16 years old, they were alone in the house for a few hours while their mother was at work. At some point, one of them walked into the kitchen and froze. The stove had somehow been ripped open all the way into the oven. My mum described it as if someone had stabbed the top of the oven, slashed it open, and then pulled that slash apart with their hands. Both of them saw it. When I later asked my aunt about the story, she described it exactly the same way. And this wasn't some kind of hallucination. They both swear they reached their hands through the hole from inside the oven to the top of the stove. They also insist they were completely sober at the time. And I believe them because they were raised in an extremely religious household, where drinking or drugs would have been out of the question. When my grandmother got home, they ran to show her the gaping hole in the stove. But when they got there, it was completely gone. The stove was perfectly normal, with no sign that anything had ever been there. This story is probably the only reason I'm not completely skeptical about the supernatural. I've had other strange experiences, but all of them can be rationally explained in some way. But this one is way beyond me. Story 20. A minor one, but why not? My wife and I are space nerds, so we follow pretty much all news about space travel. Naturally, we were hyped, though skeptical, about SpaceX's Starship project, and the glitch, it was about that very thing. About 3 years ago, SpaceX uploaded a video on their official YouTube channel, showcasing the first iteration of their Mars craft. I watched it on day 2, completely awestruck by the visuals. My wife was sitting behind me, eyes wide in amazement, watching along. When the video ended, I turned around to talk to her only, to see her looking at me, completely incredulous. But we already watched this. Some 3 weeks ago. I stared at her, confused. That didn't make any sense. I checked the posting date. Nope. It was definitely uploaded just 2 days ago. I even did a quick search in my YouTube and Chrome history, going all the way back to the beginning of the year. No trace of it. It was the first time it had been made public. I checked online. At that point, ITS, as Starship was called back then, hadn't even been officially revealed in a video format 3 weeks prior. No SpaceX upload, no leaks, nothing. Then my wife started reciting things I apparently said the first time we watched it weeks ago, word for word. Some of the things sounded eerily close to what I had just thought to myself while watching, but definitely hadn't said aloud, since I was too stunned to speak. At this point, I remembered something else. Around the 2:40 timestamp, she had casually said, "Look, now it's going to deploy panels. It looks so funny." And then right uncouth, scene played out exactly as she described, just a few seconds after her remark. So either she had actually watched the video before me, which she swore she hadn't, or she somehow knew what was about to happen. We chalked it up to either her watching it a day earlier and forgetting, or an actual glitch in the Matrix. Personally, I believe in glitches, but in a Terry Pratchett kind of way where things just happen. What the hell? Story 21. I usually tell this story when someone asks for a ghost story, though I don't actually believe in ghosts, so let's just say it fits in this category. I've always loved exploring abandoned buildings in the American West, mostly ghost towns, deserted mines, and the like, but sometimes old ranch houses can be just as interesting. Back in 2005, I was in central Nevada on a week-long exploration trip. While driving, I passed an old ranch house I had seen before. I knew it had been inhabited just a few years earlier, but now it looked completely abandoned. No cars, some windows boarded up, the kind of place that made me curious. The front door was open, so after shouting a hello and hearing no response, I decided to take a look inside. It was clear that others had been there before me. Some windows were broken from the inside, and the few belongings left behind had been rummaged through and scattered around. I wandered upstairs, stepping over pack rat droppings, and started checking out the bedrooms. One room stood out. It had clearly once belonged to a little girl. A cheap brass bed frame sat against the wall, but the mattress had been pushed halfway off. Some clothes and toys still lay around, suggesting she had been pretty young. Curious, I peeked inside the closet, but it was completely empty, except for a few wire hangers. I turned around to leave the closet and froze. There was a little girl, about 5 or 6 years old, sitting on the bed. The mattress, which had been half off the frame just moments before, was now perfectly in place. She looked up at me and said, "Hi, mister. What are you doing in my room?" I panicked. Immediately, I thought this house isn't abandoned. It must belong to a family living in extreme poverty, and I had just walked into their home uninvited. I started apologizing, explaining that I had knocked and called out but got no answer, so I thought no one was here. She didn't seem upset. "It's okay, mister," she said calmly. "Mummy isn't home. I haven't seen her in a long time. Maybe you could help me find her." Then she stood up, walked to the window, and sat on the ledge, looking out over the vast, empty field of sagebrush. I told her to come downstairs with me, and we could go find her mom together. She started to stand up, then suddenly froze. "Oh no, he's coming. I have to go, mister. He's coming. You should probably go too." And then she jumped. I raced to the window, expecting to see a little girl lying on the ground, maybe hurt, maybe crying. But when I looked down, she was gone. I ran downstairs and out of the house, looking around everywhere. There was no sign of her. She wasn't what you'd imagine a ghost to look like. No transparency, no foggy haze, nothing that screamed supernatural. She looked as real as anyone else, which made it all the more unsettling. Later that evening, I pulled into Austin, Nevada, where I met up with some friends for our planned exploration trip. That night, after a few drinks, they convinced me to tell my story to the bartender. The bartender listened carefully, then asked me to describe the location. When I did, he nodded. "Oh yeah, that's the old ranch. Sounds like you had a visit from Nellie. She likes to chat with people that stop by. She's harmless." He went on to explain that the original owner of the ranch disappeared in the late 1960s, leaving behind a note saying that he and his family were moving to Alaska to search for gold. He was later found in Oregon, but his wife and daughter were never seen again. Authorities suspected that he had murdered them somewhere along the way, but their bodies were never found. His version of the story: his wife and daughter didn't want to leave Nevada, so they left him before they even got out of the state. I loathe telling this story because I don't believe in ghosts or the paranormal, and I feel like I'm just spinning a spooky campfire tale. I actually went back to that house 2 more times before it burned down a few years later. I never saw or heard anything unusual again. Story 22. I've posted about this experience a few times now. About 2 years ago, I was driving up a short hill in the overtaking lane, trying to pass a particularly slow car. I was already going way too fast, and I knew it, but for some reason, I was completely fine with it. Then, out of nowhere, I had a sudden burst of adrenaline. I decided to accelerate even harder, determined to overtake before the lane merged back into one. Sometimes, I don't think I was successful. I think that after I crested the hill, I was still 2 abreast in a now single lane. A truck was coming up the other side of the hill, and I think I hit it head-on its left side, my right side, at considerable speed. I remember looking at the truck and thinking, I'm going to hit it, but I wasn't afraid. I remember feeling a strange sense of calm acceptance, as if everything was going to be fine. Think I saw the front of the truck hit my car. I think I saw the left side of my car crumple, the metal folding up right in front of my face. Then blackness. A second later, I was suddenly parked by a small factory building, about half a mile down the road. I felt prickly, tingly, like my whole body was buzzing with adrenaline, but the rush was already draining away. I sat there for a moment, disoriented, before deciding to cut my journey short and just go home. Since then, things have felt off. Not all the time, and not in a way that interferes with my personal life. My family and friends are exactly the same, and I'm genuinely happy. But the world itself feels different. It's hard to explain. Sometimes things feel just a little left of center, like the world is colder, grayer, duller, and I mean that literally and figuratively. Every once in a while, I'll be in a place and get a weird, uncomfortable feeling, like something isn't quite right. And then, for a brief moment, everything seems to flash to warmth and sunlight and happiness. It doesn't look different, but it feels different, like I'm seeing the same world, but how it's supposed to be. Then, just as suddenly, it flickers back to the colder, slightly off version. I'll hear news stories that feel completely wrong, like they shouldn't have happened. Sometimes, I'll Google something, certain that I know the facts only, to find out that I was completely wrong. It's not all the time, and it doesn't scare me. It's not some overwhelming existential crisis. But sometimes, when I really think about it, I wonder, did I die that day? Did I somehow shift into a version of reality that's just a little different? I don't know. Maybe it's all in my head. But sometimes, the world just feels so off. Story 23. I was cycling to work at about 8 a.m, and the traffic was heavy. It was raining, so I decided to stop for a break at a bus shelter. I sat there, watching the slow-moving traffic, waiting for the weather to clear. After a while, I got bored, but I couldn't leave because the wind had picked up so much that I would have been blown off my bicycle. I must have been sitting there for about 15 minutes when suddenly everything went silent. I looked around, trying to figure out what had happened, but there was no obvious cause. Then, the weather changed instantly, not gradually. Not like the clouds moved away, but as if they had just stopped existing. Within 3 or 4 seconds, the sky went from overcast and rainy to completely clear. I looked back down at the road, and the traffic had disappeared. At this point, I panicked. I thought I might have had some kind of medical episode, so rather than risk blacking out while cycling, I called an ambulance. When I got to the hospital, they checked me over and told me there was nothing obviously wrong, but they wanted to keep me under observation just in case. I was bored out of my mind, lying there, so I decided to check my chart. And that's when I saw the date. It was Saturday. I had been at that bus stop on Monday. 6 days of my life were just gone. Story 24. Around 2012, I traveled to a conference for work from Sacramento to Los Angeles with a coworker for a couple of days. We had some time to kill before boarding our flight back to Sac, so I decided to roam the terminal for something to eat. After walking back and forth, unable to decide, I finally settled on a random little counter for a pre-made sandwich or something. I paid, and as the woman at the counter handed me the receipt, she casually said, "Thanks, my name." In that instant, time seemed to slow down. I stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind immediately started racing. Had I pulled out my ID? I glanced at my wallet. Nope. Did I have a name tag on from the conference? Checked my blouse and jacket. Nothing. Maybe I had paid with my debit card, and she had read my name from that. Nope, I had paid with cash. I even scanned the receipt in my hand, half expecting to see my name printed on it somehow. Nothing. I wanted to ask her how she knew my name, but the words felt paralyzed on my tongue. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, overwhelmed by an unshakable feeling that something impossible had just happened. This particular day had already been emotionally heavy for me. It marked the anniversary of my father's sudden passing in 2005, so I was already feeling reflective. I took my sandwich and sat down next to my coworker, still reeling from what had happened. I turned to her and said, "So, something weird just happened." I explained the whole thing, as well as the personal significance of the date. She didn't hesitate, just smiled knowingly and said, "Oh, I love that stuff. I believe it." Even years later, I still try to rationalize it, to convince myself that there had to be some logical explanation. But it just doesn't add up. What I can't deny, though, is that sensations, the feeling of standing frozen stiff, witnessing something that shouldn't be possible unfold before me. I think we've all had that feeling at some point, that deep, visceral certainty that something unexplainable just happened. And no matter how much we try to doubt it, somewhere inside, we know it was real. Story 25. I lived in a shared house while at university, and it was a freaking odd place. Things would go missing in plain sight and then reappear moments later. And it wasn't just small things like lighters, it was big things. Jackets, plates, textbooks. At first, we tried to make sense of it, but eventually, we just got used to it. It became a running joke. If something disappeared, you just left the room for a minute, and when you came back, it would be right where you last saw it. The living room had a sliding door that led to the hallway. We were poor students, so we kept the radiators off in the hall to save money and only heated the bedrooms and the lounge. Because of that, we always kept the door shut. Most nights, though, that door would rattle violently. At first, we assumed it was just passing buses, but then someone pointed out that our street was residential. No buses, no trucks, and the underground train didn't come anywhere near the house. That realization made us all feel a little less comfortable. Then, one night, the neighbors came over and politely asked us to stop banging up and down the stairs late at night. That led to a very awkward moment, because we had been thinking the exact same thing about them. We had assumed the noise was them on their stairs, but apparently it wasn't. The weirdest moment for me happened one night while I was lying in bed, waiting for my girlfriend, A, to come home from a night out with her friends. At some point, I heard the bedroom door open. I felt the mattress shift as someone climbed in beside me. I could even feel the warmth of another body. But something was off, it didn't feel like a part. I rolled over, and there was no one there. By that point, though, we had all accepted that weird stuff happened in that house. It never felt threatening, but there was definitely something wrong with that place. I don't believe in ghosts or the paranormal. I'm a scientist and an atheist. But that house didn't feel right. Sometimes, I wonder if it had something to do with her. She had always been a little different. She was named after an older sibling who had died young, before she was born. And sometimes, she was capable of the weirdest things. I remember one night in a pub, some guy tried to pick a fight with me. He pinned me against a wall and landed a few solid punches before A stepped in. She didn't yell or fight back, she just calmly said, "Listen, I know your mother left you when you were 6, and your grandmother raised you. I know she died last month, and you're angry, but this isn't going to make you feel better. She loved you. She wouldn't want you to be like this." The guy just froze. I have no idea how she knew that, but he stopped hitting me, and then he just walked away. And that's it for tonight's collection of mind-bending, glitch-in-the-matrix stories. If these tales left you questioning reality or gave you chills, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more eerie and thought-provoking content. Hit the like button, follow for updates, and check out my other videos for even more unsettling stories. And one last thing, if you can, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your kindness and generosity truly mean the world to me. Thank you for watching, and remember, reality might not be as solid as we think. Stay aware, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.